Buckingham Palace has said King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today after experiencing the temporary side effects of his cancer treatment.
A private letter reached the king without permission. Within hours, the palace stopped functioning as normal. By nightfall, the future of the crown had shifted. The letter that bypassed the crown. The envelope arrived at Buckingham Palace just after dawn on a weekday morning in early spring, carried not by the king's private secretary but by a senior aide who had no authority to handle correspondence of this sensitivity. That detail alone was enough to unsettle everyone who witnessed it. The palace runs on layers of permission, and this letter had moved through none of them. It was placed directly onto King Charles's desk while he was reviewing a routine brief on overseas engagements. There was no announcement, no explanation. Only a quiet statement from the aide that this had come through a private channel and had been marked urgent in a way that could not be delayed. The aide left the room immediately, closing the door with a care that suggested fear rather than respect. The envelope was plain, no crest, no seal, no identifying mark beyond a short line written in dark ink. For the king. Read immediately. No one else present spoke. In that silence, Charles sensed what decades inside the institution had trained him to recognize. This was not a request. It was an intrusion. He did not open it right away. Instead, he sat still, one hand resting on the desk, eyes fixed on the envelope as if weighing whether acknowledging it would set something irreversible in motion. When he finally broke the seal, his expression changed within moments. Not shock, not panic, something colder, recognition. He read the first page, stopped, and folded the letter carefully as though containing it physically might limit its reach. Then he stood and asked for Princess Anne to be summoned immediately. Prince William was to be called in from Kensington Palace. Legal counsel was to attend without explanation. All scheduled morning meetings were postponed. By mid-morning, the palace had entered a state that senior staff would later describe as suspended tension. Phones were ringing and being silenced. Advisors were redirected without reason. Foreign offices were quietly informed of delays. Nothing was announced, yet everyone understood that something serious had occurred. By lunchtime, King Charles had not left his private study. By early afternoon, the people who mattered most were seated around a small table with the letter placed face down between them. By evening, the monarchy had crossed into a private crisis that would change everything. What had been promised in private? The letter was devastating, not because it was emotional, but because it was precise. Its language avoided accusation and sentiment entirely, relying instead on chronology and specificity. It laid out a timeline of private assurances that had never been intended to exist beyond spoken words. Conversations held in moments of exhaustion, agreements framed as temporary accommodations, assurances given without legal review or institutional oversight. Each was presented as a fact rather than a grievance. What made the document so destabilizing was not what it demanded, but what it revealed. The author did not argue that promises had been broken. They demonstrated that promises had been made in the first place. In an institution built on precedent and procedure, informal commitments were liabilities. Once written down, they ceased to be personal and became institutional risks. The author made one point immediately clear, and did so with deliberate restraint. This was not blackmail in the traditional sense. There were no emotional appeals, no threats framed in desperation. Instead, the letter described a sequence of actions the palace was about to take, and explained calmly how those actions would expose contradictions the crown could not plausibly explain away once brought into public view. At the center of the letter was a claim that King Charles had personally approved a series of informal commitments during a period when his health was more fragile than publicly acknowledged. These were not public acts or official decrees. They were private understandings, conveyed verbally and reinforced by implication rather than in writing. They had allowed certain individuals continued access, protection, or delay from consequence at moments when the institution was tightening its rules elsewhere. The letter did not challenge the king's authority directly. It questioned the context in which that authority had been exercised. It suggested that decisions made under strain might later be reframed as accommodations rather than judgments. That distinction mattered. It transformed discretion into vulnerability and turned compassion into potential compromise. What made the warning impossible to ignore was its level of detail. The letter referenced dates, locations, names of witnesses who had been present or nearby when assurances were given. It cited specific periods when schedules had been altered due to fatigue. None of these references was sensational. All of them were accurate. The precision removed any plausible claim that the author was speculating. There was no direct threat of exposure. Instead, the letter stated calmly that documentation existed, that contemporaneous records had been kept, that copies were held outside the palace in secure hands. Should the Crown proceed as planned, those records would surface through channels beyond the institution's control. The implication was devastating because it was procedural rather than personal. Anne read the letter once and pushed it away. Her reaction was immediate and unsentimental. She did not ask who had written it or how it had been delivered. To her, the central issue was not the threat but the principle. Camilla would continue her conversation without pause, her face betraying no alarm or sympathy. Her efficiency became almost cruel in its precision. She reviewed his schedule with palace officials. Concern flickered like a candle fighting wind. She kept all of it locked behind her composed expression, sharing her thoughts with absolutely no one. This was a line that should never have been crossed. The palace could not be seen to bend under pressure from an unseen actor, regardless of the discomfort the contents caused. Her position was rooted in instinct as much as experience. Yielding, even silently, would set a precedent that could not be contained. If informal promises could be leveraged into institutional restraint, then the Crown's authority would always be vulnerable to whoever documented its private moments. That risk was unacceptable. William reacted differently. He read the letter twice, not to absorb its tone, but to trace its access. Then he asked the question that changed the tone of the room. Who inside the system knows this exists? It was not a question about authorship. It was a question about exposure. The answer was unsettling. No one could be sure. The letter implied knowledge of internal schedules, private medical rhythms, and informal decision-making processes that were never centralized. This information existed in fragments across aides, clinicians, and senior staff. No single person should have had access to all of it, yet someone had assembled it. That realization shifted the focus inward. This was not an outsider guessing or inferring. This was someone who had been close enough to observe weakness and patient enough to wait. Someone who understood not only what had been promised, but when those promises would become liabilities. The threat lay not in their proximity alone, but in their timing. By the end of the meeting, one conclusion was unavoidable. The letter had not arrived by chance. It had arrived because the palace was preparing to move decisively on another matter. Someone believed they were about to lose the protection that had once been quietly granted. And rather than appeal or protest, they had chosen to remind the institution of its own informal past. In that moment, the palace understood the true danger. Not that promises had been made, but that they had been remembered. And that memory, when paired with documentation and perfect timing, could force even the most ancient institution to confront the cost of what it had once agreed to in private. The palace learns the truth is timed. In the days that followed the arrival of the letter, Buckingham Palace entered a mode that seasoned staff recognized immediately but never spoke about aloud. Containment. It was not announced. It did not appear on any schedule, yet it shaped every movement within the building. Meetings were smaller, conversations were quieter. Decisions that would normally move briskly were slowed, not out of hesitation, but calculation. The palace was no longer reacting to events, it was attempting to stay ahead of them. Legal teams were brought in under the guise of routine reviews, yet nothing was committed to paper, no emails, no formal memoranda. Advice was given verbally, often in rooms where phones were left outside and doors were closed with deliberate care. The lawyers understood the unspoken rule. Anything written could one day be read by someone else. And in moments like this, the institution survives by leaving as little trace as possible. Communications advisors worked in parallel, drafting responses to questions that had not yet been asked and might never be asked publicly if the palace moved correctly. They mapped hypothetical headlines, not just in Britain but abroad. They studied how a single phrase could be interpreted in Washington, in European capitals, in Commonwealth nations already sensitive to any sign of weakness at the center of the crown. Each scenario led to the same conclusion. If the letter surfaced, no amount of careful wording would contain it. Senior aides were assessed quietly, not for loyalty in the traditional sense, but for proximity. Who had been in rooms when decisions were made informally? Who had seen the king during moments of visible fatigue? Who had access to schedules that never appeared on official calendars? These evaluations were never framed as suspicion, they were framed as prudence, yet the effect was the same. A subtle chill settled over parts of the household as people realized they were being measured not by what they had done, but by what they might know. The most dangerous realization emerged with unsettling speed. If the contents of the letter became public, the story would not be about policy disputes or the familiar narrative of modernization. It would be about capacity, about whether a king under physical strain had been guided, influenced, or nudged into decisions that others later executed in his name. It would invite questions no monarchy can afford. Who was truly in control? And when? That narrative could not be survived. It would not matter that the decisions themselves were lawful. It would not matter that no malicious intent could be proven. Public trust does not hinge on legal nuance. It hinges on perception. Should someone not help him? The murmuring grew louder, worry transforming into something sharper, more uncomfortable. Camilla rose smoothly, and the perception of a monarch whose authority might have been exercised by proxy during moments of vulnerability would corrode confidence in ways no statement could repair. What unsettled advisors most was not merely the content of the letter, but its timing. It had arrived within days of a major institutional decision that had already been drafted, reviewed, and approved in principle. A decision that would alter long-standing arrangements and inevitably draw scrutiny. The palace now understood that the letter was not reactive. It was anticipatory. The author had known what was coming. That knowledge changed everything. This was not a case of someone responding to a public signal or a press leak. This was someone who had visibility into internal deliberations before they crossed into the formal process. Someone who understood not only what the crown intended to do, but when it intended to do it. That level of insight did not come from speculation. It came from access. And access implied trust. Once that conclusion was settled, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted again. The concern was no longer abstract. It became personal. Every conversation from the past year was quietly re-examined. Who had been present? Who had spoken? Who had listened more than they talked? Innocuous moments took on new weight. A casual remark in a corridor. A late evening discussion framed as hypothetical. A decision is explained informally before being documented. The palace had always relied on discretion as its first line of defense. Now discretion itself felt compromised. Princess Anne voiced what others were thinking but were reluctant to articulate. The problem was not simply that someone knew too much. It was that they had waited. They had allowed the palace to proceed, believing it secure, only to intervene when a reversal would be most costly. This was not impulsive. It was strategic. William absorbed this with quiet intensity. He recognized the pattern instantly. The letter was not meant to stop the decision entirely. It was meant to shape how it unfolded, to force adjustments, delays, concessions. And by doing so, it revealed a truth the palace could no longer ignore. Power was not only exercised through titles or offices, it was exercised through timing. The author had chosen their moment with precision. Within the communications wing, analysts began tracking subtle shifts in external attention. Not headlines, signals. A journalist asking an oddly specific question. a foreign correspondent requesting clarification on something not yet announced. Individually, these meant nothing. Together, they suggested awareness beyond the palace walls. The fear was not that the letter had already been shared, it was that it did not need to be. Its mere existence had already altered behavior inside the institution. Decisions were being reconsidered not solely on their merits, but on how they might interact with information that could surface at any moment. That was the most corrosive effect of all. The palace prided itself on acting deliberately, on setting the tempo rather than responding to it. Now it found itself adjusting its pace in response to an unseen hand. Every delay felt like a concession. Every adjustment felt like an acknowledgement of vulnerability. And yet the alternative was worse. If the palace pressed forward without adaptation, and the letter emerged as promised, the resulting narrative would unfold faster than any containment strategy could manage. There would be no gradual explanation, no careful context. The story would leap immediately to the most damaging interpretation. A king was protected too late, an institution that ignored warning signs, a crown that placed continuity above transparency. By the end of that week, one conclusion had taken hold across the inner circle. The truth was not only dangerous, it was timed. Released at the right moment, it could destabilize the monarchy more effectively than any open attack. The palace had always been prepared for scandal. It had contingency plans for leaks, resignations, and even abdication scenarios. What it had not fully prepared for was a challenge that sought not publicity but leverage. A threat that operated in silence, shaping outcomes without ever revealing itself. That realization marked a turning point. From that moment on, every decision would be weighed not only against tradition and public duty, but against the question the letter had forced into the open. Who truly controls the future of the crown when information itself becomes power? Once that question is asked, it cannot be ignored. A health question no one was ready to ask. The medical review was presented as routine, almost casual in its framing. A seasonal assessment, a precaution consistent with age and workload, nothing more. The language was deliberately soft, designed to reassure rather than alarm. But those invited into the room understood immediately that this was not an ordinary briefing. The atmosphere carried a weight that routine language could not disguise, and no one present mistook it for coincidence. The findings were measured and carefully balanced, stripped of drama by design. There was no declaration of crisis, no immediate danger, no urgent intervention required. Yet embedded within the language was a recommendation that could not be overlooked without consequence. Reduced exposure to prolonged stress, delegation during periods of fatigue, a narrower daily workload to preserve long-term stability. Each phrase appeared reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a warning. In any other context, this assessment would have remained private, filed quietly among confidential medical records and discussed only with the king himself. Adjustments would have been made discreetly, schedules softened without explanation, appearances shortened under the guise of efficiency. The public would have noticed nothing. The institution had navigated such moments before, always without comment and without fracture. But this was not any other context. The arrival of the letter had altered the environment in which every decision now existed. It had introduced the possibility that vulnerability could be retroactively weaponized. Those choices made in moments of strain might later be questioned not for their outcomes, but for the condition of the man who authorized them. The medical review, once neutral, became pivotal. He insists on maintaining every engagement, every speech, every tedious meeting. She drank deeply, her eyes hard as diamonds. The question was no longer simply how to protect the king's health. It was about protecting the legitimacy of his authority in an environment where doubt could spread faster than truth. If the public ever believed that decisions had been shaped by exhaustion rather than judgment, the damage would extend far beyond personal concern. It would reach into the core of the crown itself, undermining confidence in continuity and control. That understanding reframed the entire response. Protection now takes the form of preparation rather than concealment. The institution did not wait for questions to be asked. It began structuring answers before anyone outside the inner circle even knew there was a question. Briefings expanded quietly, not in volume but in depth. Context was added. Historical precedent was revisited. Lines of authority were clarified with renewed precision. Responsibilities were redistributed with the subtlety of long-practiced choreography. No announcement was made, no titles were altered. Yet within days the flow of information shifted. Papers that once reached the king alone now passed through additional hands beforehand. Her sapphire brooch caught the afternoon light. Consultations widened, not to dilute authority but to reinforce it. Every step was taken with care, ensuring that nothing appeared reactive. Prince William began receiving material earlier than before, not as a declaration, not as a signal of transition, but as a safeguard built into process. He was briefed in parallel, not above or below, but alongside. The language used was technical and procedural, avoiding any implication of necessity. Yet everyone involved understood the significance. This was not about ambition or impatience, it was about resilience. The decision to include him more deeply was framed internally as temporary, though no one defined what temporary meant. It was described as prudent, as responsible, as aligned with best practice during periods of sustained pressure. No one said the word health aloud in those conversations. It hovered unspoken, present in every pause and every careful phrasing. Charles understood what was happening. He did not need it explained. The king had lived long enough within the institution to recognize the signs of adjustment. He noticed the additional voices in briefings, the slight reordering of discussions, the moments when decisions were framed with an extra layer of validation. None of it was overt, all of it was intentional. He did not resist these changes. There were no objections, no expressions of offense, no insistence on maintaining old rhythms. Resistance would have drawn attention, and attention was the last thing he wanted. But neither did he embrace them. He did not frame the shift as relief or welcome support. He accepted it with the quiet reserve of someone who understood the cost of acknowledgement. Privately, the moment carried its own weight. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition that the letter had not simply raised a question about events. It had forced the institution to look at time itself, at endurance, at the margin between strength and strain. The medical review had confirmed what years of service already suggested, but confirmation changed the stakes. From that point forward, every decision carried an added layer of scrutiny, not because trust was gone, but because trust had to be defended. The health question no one had been ready to ask had now been asked in the only way the palace ever asked such things, quietly, indirectly, and with consequences that would unfold long after the room had emptied. What had begun as a routine assessment became a fulcrum, not because it revealed weakness, but because it exposed how fragile perception could be. The institution did not panic, it adjusted. And in that adjustment lay the first visible shift toward a future that was no longer theoretical, but actively being prepared. William is briefed for a future that accelerates. William approached the shift with deliberate restraint, conscious of how easily movement could be mistaken for intent. There were no declarations, no visible markers of ambition, no attempt to claim space that had not yet been formally offered. He understood instinctively that the most dangerous signal the monarchy could project was haste. History had taught the institution that acceleration without explanation invited speculation, and speculation rarely remained contained. Yet those watching closely could see the change taking shape. It appeared not in ceremony or public language, but in rhythm. William's presence increased not in volume, but in consistency. He was present earlier, longer, and in rooms he had not occupied with such regularity before. Nothing about it felt sudden. That was the point. The transition was being allowed to look inevitable, rather than engineered. Briefings expanded in both complexity and scope. He was no longer receiving summaries alone, but context as well. Not just conclusions, but the arguments that preceded them and the risks that had been debated and dismissed. The information arrived without ceremony, delivered as if this had always been the arrangement. The subtlety of that decision mattered more than any announcement could have. With each briefing came an unspoken expectation. Not that he would decide, but that he would understand. Not that he would act, but that he would be ready to act if required. The palace was not transferring authority, it was duplicating comprehension. That distinction preserved the dignity of the present while quietly reinforcing the stability of the future. Foreign counterparts noticed before the press ever could. The protocol remained unchanged, but the tone shifted. Conversations with William lingered longer than before. Questions once directed elsewhere were now posed to him as well, sometimes redundantly, sometimes as if by instinct. There was no overt acknowledgement, yet the recalibration was unmistakable to those trained to read between gestures. He did not correct it, nor did he encourage it. William responded with the same measured neutrality he applied to everything else: calm, precise, unrevealing. In diplomacy, such consistency signaled reliability rather than ambition. It reassured without committing. That restraint did more to stabilize perception than any formal statement ever could. Within the palace, the adjustment unfolded with equal care. Staff were not instructed to defer to him, but they began to consult him earlier in the process. His perspective was sought not because it was required, but because it was useful. That difference allowed the shift to appear organic, rooted in practicality rather than preparation. The monarchy moved best when it appeared to be responding rather than planning. The letter remained sealed. Its physical presence is unchanged, its contents confined to a narrowing circle. No reference was made to it in briefings. No acknowledgement appeared in language or posture. And yet its influence was everywhere. It had not dictated action, it had demanded readiness. The palace had understood the distinction immediately. Its author remained silent, as if silence itself were confirmation. There were no follow-up communications, no attempts to apply pressure or claim credit. That restraint suggested confidence. Whoever had written the letter knew that the institution would respond not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. The absence of further contact was as deliberate as the initial delivery. Because the palace had done what the letter demanded without ever acknowledging the threat, the balance of power quietly shifted back where it belonged. There was no confrontation to escalate, no narrative to exploit. The crown had moved first, but invisibly. In doing so, it denied the author the satisfaction of reaction. William understood this as well. He never asked to see the letter. He did not inquire about its contents or speculate about its origin. That restraint was noted. Curiosity would have been natural. Resisting it demonstrated discipline. It showed that he understood the danger of knowing too much too soon, especially when knowledge itself could alter perception. Instead, he focused on preparation, not for accession but for responsibility. He studied patterns rather than events. He listened more than he spoke. He absorbed institutional memory from those who had navigated similar moments decades earlier. The future acceleration did not mean the present had lost authority. It meant the margin for error had narrowed. Charles watched this with a complex mixture of relief and resolve. Relief that the institution could adapt without rupture. Resolve to ensure that adaptation does not become an assumption. The king remained fully engaged, fully present, and fully aware of the implications. Delegation was not abdication. Preparation was not surrender. Their relationship adjusted subtly in response. Conversations deepened. Certain topics were explored more frankly than before, not because of urgency, but because postponement no longer served the institution. The future was no longer a distant abstraction. It was an active consideration that shaped how decisions were framed and communicated. Outside the palace, nothing appeared to have changed. Schedules continued, statements remained measured, appearances followed expectation. That continuity was intentional. Stability was not something to be announced. It was something to be demonstrated repeatedly until doubt lost its footing. The crown had adjusted course, not by turning sharply, but by correcting its alignment. The change was real, but it left no wake. William's briefing for a future that accelerates was not a rehearsal for succession, it was a reinforcement of continuity. And in that quiet recalibration, the institution reaffirmed its most enduring strength, the ability to evolve without ever appearing to move. By nightfall, the monarchy is rewritten. By the end of that week, nothing official had changed, and yet everything had. The king remained sovereign in title and function. The palace remained calm in appearance and tone. There were no announcements, no statements, no corrective briefings issued to the press, to the public eye, continuity held without visible strain. The machinery of monarchy continued to move with familiar precision. Inside the institution, however, alignment had quietly shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but definitively. Certain conversations now happen earlier than before. Certain decisions were framed with additional context. Authority was still centralized, but awareness had been widened. The difference was subtle enough to escape casual notice, yet permanent enough to alter the internal balance. The letter was secured under protocols reserved for matters that could not be categorized. It was monitored not for content but for consequence. Access was limited and never expanded. No copies were made. No annotations added. It existed as a fixed object rather than a living document. Its power lay not in what it said, but in what it had forced the institution to consider. It was never acknowledged in writing or speech. No reference to its arrival appeared in records that could later be examined. This absence was deliberate. Acknowledging the letter would elevate it. To deny it would be to invite curiosity. Silence preserved control. The palace understood that the most dangerous narratives were not those that emerged loudly, but those that took shape through suggestion. What the monarchy learned in those days was not simply that it could adapt under pressure. It learned how quickly legitimacy could become a subject rather than an assumption. The letter had not accused. It had implied. And implication required defense long before it required rebuttal. The institution responded by reinforcing its internal coherence rather than addressing an external threat. By nightfall on the final day of that week, processes had been refined without being rewritten. Delegation was clearer, consultation was broader. Safeguards were embedded where discretion once sufficed. No one described these changes as reforms. They were framed as refinements, the natural evolution of a system that valued endurance over drama. The king remained fully engaged throughout. He attended briefings. He reviewed documents. He spoke with authority that was neither diminished nor challenged. And yet he understood that something irreversible had occurred. Not a loss of power, but a redistribution of weight. Certain responsibilities now rested across a wider structure, making them harder to isolate and easier to defend. There was no resentment in this recognition, only realism. The crown had survived for generations precisely because it understood when to tighten and when to yield. Yielding did not mean surrender. It meant ensuring that no single moment of strain could later be isolated and used to undermine the whole. In that sense, the letter had accelerated a logic already present. Those closest to the process understood that power, once quietly redistributed, never fully returns to where it began. It settles into new patterns. It creates new expectations. Even if the original conditions pass, the adjustments remain. The institution does not forget lessons learned under pressure. It absorbs them and moves forward, altered, but intact. Outside the palace walls, none of this registered. The monarchy continued to project calm. Engagements proceeded. Language remained measured. The absence of disruption was itself the message. Stability was not declared. It was demonstrated through repetition and restraint. In that consistency, the public found reassurance without ever knowing why it was needed. And yet the truth remained. An ancient crown had been redirected by a single piece of paper arriving at the wrong moment. Not through confrontation, but through timing. Not through force, but through implication. By nightfall, the monarchy had not been overthrown or exposed. It had been rewritten in the quietest way possible. Through awareness, through preparation, and through the understanding that survival often depends on changing before change is demanded. What happens next will not be announced. It will be absorbed, normalized, and felt only in hindsight. This is how power truly shifts inside institutions that survive centuries. If you want the next chapter as it unfolds and the private reckoning that follows silence, stay here. Subscribe, follow, and watch closely. The crown never explains itself. It simply moves.